It does feel the same. That's what Jacob Philadelphia said when he first touched President Obama's hair. In that moment, Jacob realized that the most powerful man on earth was Black, just like him. And now, no matter what the world tells them, Black kids all over the world will forever believe that they too can become president of the United States. Because if someone who looks like them has already done it, they know for a fact that they can do it too. Former White House photographer Pete Souza immortalized this moment in this picture. It inspired millions of people all over the world, especially young people of color. That's what belonging feels like. To me, belonging is knowing that you have a place in your society, especially when you see people who look like you in positions of power. But I have not always felt like this. Recently, I felt, yet again, what it is like to not belong in a society, a country, and a world that I have every right to belong in. This past summer, I interned for the United States Congress. I had the amazing opportunity to be around people who were just as passionate about social change as I was. I spent the first day getting to know people in my surroundings. And on my second day, I went to the ID office to get my picture taken for my official intern badge. So I stood in the very long line and waited to get my picture taken. I looked around and noticed something. There were only 2 people of color in the entire line, and I was one of them. I also noticed that I was the only Black woman in the entire line. And I began to get this uncomfortable but familiar feeling. It's that feeling that I always got when I was in a space where no one looked like me. Here I was, interning with people who had political ambitions and wanted to help change the world, just like I did. Here I was, looking the part, wearing a blazer, a dress shirt, and dress pants, just like they were. Here I was, waiting to receive an intern badge that would tell me that I belonged here in Congress. But I did not feel like I belonged. I couldn't help but think that this feeling of not belonging was tied to something much more complex than me being the only Black girl in line. We were all interning for Congress. We were all here because we were aspiring politicians. We were the future leaders of America. But if this ID line is reflective of our country's future leadership, then what does that tell you? It tells you who will get a seat at the table and who won't. It tells you who will be making the important decisions. It tells you whose voices will be heard. I was annoyed, but I looked down at my ID badge and reminded myself that my presence here in Congress as a Black woman meant something. It meant everything. And so with that, I clipped the badge to the waist of my pants and went back to my office. After that day, I began to notice how often I felt like I did not belong. I was especially aware of this feeling at congressional intern lectures. One day, Democratic leader Nancy Pelosi came to speak to all the interns. I was excited, so I arrived early and took a seat in the 3rd row of the auditorium. The entire room was crowded within minutes. As I looked around, I noticed that in a sea of white, there were very few brown faces. When Nancy Pelosi walked onto the stage, I clapped along with everyone else. I listened as she gave her speech. After she spoke, we got to ask some questions. One person was bold enough to ask a question about the 2016 presidential election. But for the most part, the interns asked questions about policies. So I was surprised when a few interns asked questions about race. At one point, Nancy Pelosi talked about Black women's voter turnout. As she spoke, she looked in my direction. And in that moment, I remembered that I was one of the very few Black women in the entire auditorium. And all I could think was, here we are in Congress talking about Black women, but where are they? Why am I one of the very few brown faces in this entire auditorium? Does anyone else not see this as a problem? After that lecture, I was cynical. Why should people of color participate in politics, only to show up to Congress, like I did, and see that no one looks like us? But here's the great thing about life. Whenever you're cynical or down in the dumps, something or someone comes around to inspire you again. And for me, that someone was civil rights activist and Congressman John Lewis. One day, I met John Lewis in the hallway. I walked up to him and introduced myself. We shook hands and I thanked him for his activism. And when he invited me to stop by his office, of course I said yes. When I walked into John Lewis's office, I looked around. There was something different about his office and the way it looked. After a few minutes, I finally understood what it was that made John Lewis's office stand out from the rest. His entire staff was diverse. Even quite a few of his interns were people of color. And in that moment, I felt just like Jacob felt in the Oval Office. I felt like I belonged. Congressman Lewis and I talked about why it is so important that people of color are elected into office. I told him that sometimes people of color, including me, find it so hard to be optimistic about our role in politics. But I will always remember when Congressman Lewis looked me straight in the eye and reminded me that I needed to get involved in politics. Because if I did not participate, politicians could do anything and say anything, and I would have no say. And that's when I realized that it's not just about people of color being elected into office. It's about people of color having the power to create policies, especially policies that affect our own communities. Because here's the thing, racial representation is not the be-all and end-all for belonging. Just because this country decides to elect a few Asian senators or a few Native American mayors does not mean that we automatically have equity and justice. America needs to do more than elect people of color. America needs to listen to people of color. Because unfortunately, when people of color are sitting at the table and are ready to discuss policies, our voices are rarely heard. According to a 2015 study by Professor Nicholas Stephanopoulos at the Chicago Law School, Black politicians have a harder time enacting their policies, especially policies that reflect the interests of the Black community. For example, if a Black politician introduces a federal policy that has no white support, then this policy has a 10% chance of being passed into law. But if a Black politician introduces a federal policy that has universal white support, then this policy has a 60% chance of being passed into law. So what's the problem? One might say the problem is racism, and the problem is racism. But let's look at the byproduct of racism. The problem is access. It's about the fact that people of color have to rely on people who have access in order to get the majority of their legislation passed. And throughout history, and even to this very day, the people who have had access and continue to have access are white people. And the numbers don't lie. 81% of Congress is white. 81%. Meanwhile, people of color only make up 19% of our current Congress. And so this leads us to some very crucial questions. What would it look like to live in a world where everyone has access? What would it look like to live in a world where politicians of color can successfully advocate for their policy preferences without always having to succumb to the policy preferences of white politicians? What would it look like to live in a world where our Congress is reflective of our country's diversity? The good news is that all of this is possible. How? This leads us back to the importance of racial representation. In order for everyone to have access, people of color must be elected into office. And when that happens, when people of color are elected into office and are sitting at the table and are ready to discuss policies, our voices will be heard. Because here's the thing, we cannot choose to just elect people of color. and then decide not to listen to them. We cannot choose to just listen to people of color, but then decide not to elect them. We must elect and listen. We must do both of these things all of the time. This does not just apply to Congress. This applies to every aspect of life. If you are wondering how you can possibly help increase racial representation and create a true sense of belonging for everyone, just think about the kind of platform that you have. If you are a recruiter for a modeling agency, recruit more models of color and make sure that everyone in the modeling agency has different races and ethnicities. Are you a CEO? Hire more people of color. But don't just do it for your company's diversity stats. Truly listen to our opinions at corporate meetings. Build a company culture that involves us in decision-making processes. Students, elect qualified students of color to your student government, because we do exist. If you are a professor, choose literature that has racial representation for people of color. This means that you must stop always centering white authors and protagonists, because they are not the only authors and protagonists that exist. And if you are white, understand that you benefit from racism greatly, all at the expense of people of color. So use your current position in society to help dismantle systems of oppression. And when we dismantle a system that thrives on the exclusion and marginalization of people of color, and build a just and fair system in its place, then there will be a true sense of belonging for everyone. One day, when I am an elected official, I will take a seat at the table. I will advocate for policies that I care deeply about, such as education, climate change, racial equity, and ending mass incarceration. Depending on my position in government, I will either spend parts of my day voting on legislation or signing bills into law. But no matter what I am doing, I will always return to my office to meet with my constituents. I especially want young people to come visit me and share their ideas for change. And when that happens, I want to be the person who will bend down and let a little girl touch my hair so that she can say, yes, it does feel the same.